We have a recent article from the New York Post, which touched on the question, is transgenderism among kids largely a fad? Now, the obvious answer to this is yes, of course it is. In fact, I believe the two primary reasons why we've seen such a massive explosion of kids identifying as LGBTQ plus IA barbecue is this. One, it's a shortcut to getting famous and possibly making money. Look at the Dylan Mulvaney fiasco, right? Despite the massive blowback that Dylan Mulvaney received himself and Bud Light and all that, the young self-identifying trans person has made millions of dollars for the charade, right? So he's made a lot of money doing this. Being a social media influencer is one of the most sought after and desired careers for young people in America today. So it can hardly be a surprise that the enticement of fame and fortune would cause a certain segment of youth today to adopt this infectious ideology for themselves. And then there's a second reason that I believe why this has exploded. If you want to be accepted by your peers, the easiest way to accomplish this, particularly among young men and white men especially, is to identify as one of these groups. Once done, it inoculates you from persecution by your peers. Young men and women see this. Being a victim is one of the quickest ways to elevate your social status. And in today's world, social status is everything. Now, to highlight the change, let's take a look at some of the hard data here. There is a Gallup poll in 2021, which according to their poll data, the percentage of U.S. adults identifying as LGBTQ+ varies significantly by generation. For example, Generation X, which is born between 1965 and 1980, the percentage of those who identify as LGBTQ is 4.2%. For baby boomers, though, this is between 1946 and 1964, it's 2.6%. And for traditionalists born before 1946, the figure drops to under 1%. Now, there's also a report by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC, in 2021, which found that about 1 in 4 school students identifies as LGBTQ+ today, with 75.5% identifying as heterosexual. This indicates a significant increase from 11% in just as recent as 2015 to 26% in 2021 rather. Gallup's polling data shows a significant rise in LGBTQ identification among U.S. adults from 3.5% in total in 2012 to 5.6% in 2020. This increase is particularly pronounced among younger generations, with 1 in 6 adults in Generation Z considering themselves LGBTQ. The increase in the LGBT identification is largely driven by younger generations. For instance, the Gallup poll found that 20.8% of Gen Z adults identified as LGBTQ+ in 2021, which is up from 10.5% in 2017. This contrasts with more stable identification rates among older generations. But the extreme and meteoric rise of this identification is directly tied to social media and the promotion of these lifestyles fads to the youth, not to mention the propaganda surrounding it in most television shows and movies. Hell, all you really need to do is look at every Disney or Marvel movie since Endgame, and you'll find an endless onslaught of woke ideology overtly being preached at to those who watch this content. So, that being said, let's turn to the article in question from the New York Post titled "Believe Data About Activists." Researchers at the Netherlands University recently released the results of a landmark 15-year study of 2,700 children starting at age 11. They tracked the gender non-contentedness of these children over the years and found, quote, in early adolescence, 11% of participants reported gender non-contentedness. The prevalence decreased with age and was 4% at the last follow-up around age 26. The researchers concluded this. Gender non-contentedness, while being relatively common during early adolescence, in general decreases with age and appears to be associated with a poorer self-concept and mental health throughout development. In other words, the article goes on to say, most of the children in this study who were feeling gender dysphoric in their awkward teenage years had shaken it off and adjusted by early adulthood, and the dysphoria was associated with bad self-esteem and mental health problems. This is fully at odds, the article author wrote, with the policy pushing its way through American schools and medical institutions, kids who declare themselves transgender, no matter what age, need to be affirmed, an idea that sometimes leads to children taking hormone blockers or getting surgery to attempt gender transition. These interventions can have lifelong consequences, but some doctors aren't even sure if the child should be informed before they take action, meaning a lot of hospitals like to bury the potentially damaging information you can get from going through these surgeries. There were leaked documents last month from the World's Professional Association for Transgender Health found that some doctors don't think disclosing potential risks is even necessary. As the Post reported, practitioners believe telling a 14-year-old about possible fertility consequences is like talking to a blank wall. Meaning, if you get puberty blockers, before you hit puberty, you will be sterilized. You can never go back, and you can never have children. Anyway, a child psychologist said this. He said, out of their developmental range to understand the extent to which some of those medical interventions are impacting them. If children can't understand the medical consequences of an entirely elective procedure that isn't necessary to benefit their health or save their life, perhaps it's best not to do it. So, the viewpoint from this article is driving home the viewpoint that societal influences, rather than, say, inherent gender dysphoria, is driving this increase in young people who identify as transgender. Now, the activists and trans cultists who cannot bear for there to be any dissent on this matter or any questions to their mantra for the trans issue will stop at nothing to silence debate around the practice of child mutilation through surgery. Anyone who disagrees with this is immediately labeled as a transphobe or worse. There has been a desperate attempt to shore up this practice of child mutilation, as many so-called experts are emphasizing the importance of affirming a child's gender identity as a critical aspect of supporting their mental health and well-being. For instance, a study published in Pediatrics, they're discussing gender identity 5 years after social transition, all right? So back in 2022, they found that concerns about early childhood social transitions among transgender youth, that these youth may later change their minds retransition, are not supported by the data, they claim. Their study found that the majority of transgender youth who socially transitioned at a young age continued to identify as transgender 5 years later. The study also suggested that for many transgender youth, their gender identity is a deeply felt and persistent aspect of who they are rather than a temporary phase or fad. These people want to go beyond the science, my friends. I mean, who cares about the hard reality of binary gender or sex? Why, if we just reinforce their mental illness with enough medical and psychological and social support, then perhaps we can keep those who identify as transgender and gender diverse happy. So, the idea of it being a fad comes from several factors. First is increased visibility and discussion. Many people are arguing that the increased visibility and discussion of transgender issues in media and online platforms could contribute to more children and adolescents questioning their gender or identifying as transgender. This perspective suggests that there is greater societal awareness and acceptance, which leads to more youth exploring gender identity, potentially inflating the numbers. And we can see this with the rapid increase in just a couple of decades. Obviously, social media plays a big role here. Okay. Then we have rapid onset gender dysphoria, or ROGD. Now, the concept of this, proposed by Dr. Lisa Littman, suggests that some adolescents may suddenly express a transgender identity due to social influences without prior history of gender dysphoria. While this concept has been highly controversial and criticized for methodological flaws, it has been cited by some as evidence of a trend or fad. Then there are changing demographics and diagnosis. So some points to the changing demographics of those seeking gender-affirming care, such as an increase in adolescents assigned female at birth, as evidence of a trend. However, again, you've got these so-called experts that are cautioning against interpreting these changes as indicative of a fad, noting that they could reflect broader shifts in societal acceptance and understanding of gender diversity. And then, of course, we have the growing detransitioning epidemic, which over time, I believe will become a much larger issue than it is today. Right now, here in the US, it's about 8% of those that go through the surgeries that then want to detransition. And of course, you can never fully detransition. You're basically ruined as a human being. And so there's not much you can do there. You know, you're going to look mutilated for the rest of your life. And so, yeah, anyway, we're seeing this trend as there are more post-op trans people, meaning they went through that chopadegotomy or addictomy procedure, who find that the surgeries did not in fact fix their mental issues. And indeed, there has been a growing argument for the banning of sex change procedures, or so-called gender-affirming surgeries, in minors, and potentially extending these bans to adults as well. And the reasons are as follows. Now, obviously, the big issue when we're talking about minors is maturity and consent. For minors, the argument against allowing these types of surgery comes from the minor's lack of cognitive maturity to make life-altering decisions about their bodies. This is similar, by the way, to the rationale behind prohibiting minors from making the legal decisions like voting, drinking, and smoking, let alone something far more serious and permanent like getting tattoos, which, by the way, is not only illegal for anyone under the age of 18 to acquire, but for anyone performing a tattoo, it's a crime if you do it on a minor. Another problem here is the irreversibility and regret. So there is obviously the potential for regret if you go through these surgeries. The gender-affirming surgeries, as you can imagine, are irreversible and carry the risk of regret. This is compared to BIID, or body integrity identity disorder, where you have an irreversible nature of amputations. And so there's a huge ethical concern here. And then there's detransitioning, where there's a growing discussion about individuals who regret transitioning and choose to detransition. This is also used to argue that the possibility of regret should be taken seriously and could justify a ban. Then there is medical and psychological complexity issues here, which takes me back to BIID, or body integrity identity disorder. Now, what that is, in case you don't know, it is an extremely rare phenomenon where you have people who literally desire to amputate one or more of healthy limbs on their bodies, or maybe even they want to become paralyzed. They literally believe that that's what they're supposed to be, missing limbs or paralyzed. And these people will oftentimes mutilate themselves, or they will ask surgeons for an amputation or for the transection of their spinal cord, which is insane, right? And so there are comparisons to the transgender issue and the BIID. Now, we do not allow people with BIID to be treated with amputation due to ethical concerns about harming a healthy body. And arguments against the trans fad is suggesting that this is very similar, that gender dysphoria should not be treated with irreversible surgeries either. Instead, we should be giving people psychological treatment. And it is argued that psychological interventions should be prioritized over surgical ones, especially when the desire for body alteration may stem from psychological distress. Now, I think this is obvious. Yeah, of course we should be pushing that first. The idea of just saying, you know what, today you woke up and you decided your penis didn't deserve to be there, let's chop it off. Maybe you need some psychological help first. You might have a problem, right? Which brings us to the ethical and medical precedent that we're sending here. So in general, healthcare operates on the idea of first do no harm, right? The principle of non-malfeasance in medicine, and doctors are not to perform procedures that could potentially harm their patients. Now, this principle is invoked to argue against surgeries that alter healthy body parts. And again, this, they view it in the same vein as the whole transgender surgeries. And then there is the lack of consensus when it comes to the trans surgeries. The medical and psychiatric communities do not universally agree on what is the best approach to treating gender dysphoria when it comes to the trans community. And this lack of consensus is used to argue for a more cautious approach, which obviously, right? I mean, we're talking about permanent alterations. But of course, the advocates for body mutilation, those who are pro-body mutilation in the name of transgenderism, argue that many medical professionals, and organizations advocate for gender-affirming care as a legitimate and necessary treatment for gender dysphoria. And I love how they call it gender-affirming care when you're talking about straight up just chopping things off, right? Anyway, they will emphasize positive outcomes and improved quality of life for many transgender individuals, even though that in of itself, I believe, is questionable at best. How much are you really improving your life by going through these surgeries? Because the reality is, these kinds of surgeries and medical puberty blockers, they aren't going to bring you the satisfaction you want here, right? So let's say that you're a dude and you decide that you're a female now, and that's what you think you are, and you want to go through the surgery. So you go to the surgery. Well, the sad reality is you're going to be desired by very few people. straight heterosexual males are not going to want to have sex with you. And then you're going to just be alienated from both sexes, really. So I believe that these kinds of surgeries and medical puberty blockers should be 100% banned for minors. Because when you're a kid, you have no reason at all that you should be getting these done to you. It's a permanent alteration that you can never go back from. And as a minor, 100% no. If we're not even allowing tattoos, why the hell are we allowing these kinds of surgeries? So there's that. Now, when it comes to consenting adults, if not outright banned, at minimum, we should require years of psychological therapy and help before even being considered for such a process. Because, I mean, we're talking about an incredibly extreme procedure. And hey, you know, if you're still hell-bent on getting these procedures after all these years of counseling and psychological help, fine. As long as you are completely and fully aware of all potential downsides and side effects, you need to be 100% aware of these things. And if we're not doing that, then I think, no, don't allow it. But that's just me.